welcome to a new episode of Legal for Tech, the podcast. So, guys, you do recognize my voice. It's always Rosie here. And as I've said many times, this is just for students and young professionals who are very interested in anything that has to do with technology. And yes, it's regulation, but today I promise we're actually going to talk about technology. I am joined by my friend and colleague and great producer of this podcast, Giacomo. Hi, Giacomo. Great to see you.
We are indeed. Hi, Rosie. Thank you.
I'm super happy to see you because today it's technology day. No, I'm joking, but like we are focusing a bit more on technology and we're doing it with a great professional whom I've met in Munich. So I'm super happy to see her again, this time online, but it's never too late. Katharine Jarmul, welcome on the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Super exciting. I really hope I didn't butcher your surname.
No,
Um,
all good.
okay, that's great. I'm so sorry in case I have. I told our listeners that we met in Munich, and the reason why we met in Munich is that I was at an IAPP Knowledge Net chapter in the city, and you were giving a great talk seminar. I mean, it's open to interpretation, but I absolutely got in love with your work. So I want our listeners to know what you've been doing so far, why you're here today, but also why, tell them what you told us, if that's possible.
I'm not sure if I can exactly remember everything that I said in that workshop, but yeah, I've been a technologist for over 20 years. I started my career in machine learning, data science. I actually worked as a data journalist as my first job. And I switched to working on privacy and security in machine learning systems and data science systems about 8 years ago. And so that's been my focus. And I wrote a book that many more legal professionals bought than I ever expected. And it's called Practical Data Privacy. It covers a lot about leading privacy technologies and how to integrate them into machine learning AI data workflows. So yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk about how we can do privacy by design in AI systems.
So the first question is exactly about that. We know you're an expert coder and an advocate for the implementation of effective privacy by design technology. In your opinion, what is privacy by design and why does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, privacy by design, I think most people will be familiar with, has been around now for quite some time and really looks at from a ground principle of how we architect systems, how we design systems, and then really how do we actually interact with people using systems so that we really think about human rights and agency and the accompanying privacy as a first order principle in how we build a system. I think the principles stand true today. I kind of spent some time in my book kind of saying, how do we do this in a data system? But I think the principles stand well, even still by themselves now, 20 years later, basically, at this point in time, which is amazing. The one thing that I notice, or I guess maybe I think you're going to get into this, is taking principles and implementing them into code or architecture or a system is not only extremely difficult, it's a very learned, I think, multidisciplinary skill that a lot of teams don't do often enough.
Wonderful. And yeah, let's kind of break down that answer for our listeners. So there's a type of kind of question that would go towards the idea of understanding how privacy by design evolved throughout, because you said it's been 20 years, which is something that probably some of our listeners would not be expecting because privacy by design is something mentioned, for example, in the GDPR. That's a relatively new document. It's been around since 2016, really. So it's like privacy by design as a principle, as a concept, is much kind of date back in time. And we probably have to understand how it evolved, especially because you are an expert in machine learning. So it would be interesting to know how it's evolving even now with the advent of AI. So that's something I'm going to ask you. And then potentially trying to understand, as you said, implementation is different from thinking about privacy by design. So principles and their actionability are two different things. So let's also think about how effective privacy by design is, especially when it comes to data protection.
Yeah, I mean, I think so privacy by design, the original design document, which was written by a computer scientist who had also an interest in privacy, and I am going to mispronounce her name, and Kavukian. Yeah, I apologize. It was a design document that was kind of coming around as we were starting to build, I guess you could think of it as like Web 1.0 software. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, when my generation of developers was kind of where you are now in your legal career, like in the beginning years of getting started in our careers. And it was really cool because I think when we look at the early ways that the web developed, there was actually, if we look back at IE6, some of the specs for IE6 were actually GDPR compliant with their cookie handling and stuff like that. So there was a lot of conversation and engagement from WC3 and from many people advocating for how do we build privacy into the way the internet works? How do we build privacy into the way the softwares work? Obviously, a lot of those battles got lost. I would say not necessarily due to just lobbying and things like this. I think as with most technologies, systems evolved and they evolved faster than the regulatory environment could evolve around them and or advocacy groups. And so I also came up in like the big data era where it was quite regular to do massive web scraping to start to analyze data at scale. Many people obviously were doing this without consent or without a legitimate interest and an end, right? So like that kind of entered, and I do think that privacy by design today is much better to look at it within the context of some of the principles that GDPR sets alongside the original design document. And as a technologist, I think you're kind of also keeping an eye on one of the concepts from GDPR that I really like, which is what is a reasonable effort given the state of the art technology that we have today? And I think that that's a concept that, in my experience, GDPR brought to the table that can help us look at this design document from, 20 years ago on privacy by design and say, okay, are we using what we would think of as the most current state-of-the-art techniques to do things like analyze how it is we're implementing this stack and privacy and security and other types of user agency within the stack? Are we doing it kind of with today's best practices, with what we know as technologists today? And I think that that's kind of where we can link in what you were talking about, which is when we look at machine learning systems today, even in my career, they've evolved significantly, right? I come from a language background, so the language modeling that we were even doing, 5, 6 years ago is not at all the LLM language modeling that we're doing today. And so we're continuously having to ask how I design, if I'm going to design, let's say, an agent-based framework or a large-scale LLM provider, how am I taking a look at how data is working in my system, and how am I trying to look at where am I allowing users to communicate transparently about their privacy needs? How am I integrating that into the way I design this? And what protections am I putting in place to minimize their exposure if it's unnecessary for, the system I'm actually trying to build? And that's still a very hard and challenging technology problem, which is exciting and why I'm still working in privacy and machine learning.
Do you think that privacy by design is affected with the AI nowadays? And what are, for you, the best techniques for enhancing privacy in this AI world?
Yeah, it's a good question. We probably can't answer it in a short podcast format very well, but Let's just take like a example I was working on today. So I've been working on a deep dive into Claude Code and other coding assistants on what's the data they collect, how do they transmit it, how does the system overall work to communicate about things like privacy and security needs to the user. And let's just say the current state of agent assisted, or let's say LLM assisted code development doesn't really have privacy as a first order principle. The question is kind of like, am I allowed to read everything in all of the folders that you give me access to? And then can I randomly execute code on them? Now, of course, there is a prompting, there is an exchange. That does require some permissioning. There's, of course, a lot of um, guides on how to properly sandbox, things like this. But let's take a realistic workflow. If at your work environment there are developers, and let's say they're being told they need to use an AI coding assistant, as many, many software developers are being told right now, and some of them want to, right? That's fine. But some are being told because we want to be a quote unquote AI first company, we have to develop with these things, right? So what like reasonably are you supposed to do when the interface that you're given is basically saying, give me full folder access, let me read and execute things, and that this is part of how you're supposed to use the tool, right? There's just going back to privacy by design principles of how do we deal with least permissioning first and then expand? How do we deal with informing and being quite transparent with the user about what's happening? It's very clear that some of these paradigms, some of these workflows are not going back to those first order principles. However, I'm pretty convinced that that will develop over time. At the current rate, there is like these tools are quite immature at this point in time. And obviously, like I said, throughout my career, I've seen tools both go and go in both directions, but one can hope, obviously, and advocate that we can start to build tools that have a little bit better understanding of what do we mean when we say, hey, I'm here to quote unquote assist you as an LLM that's been trained for software programming. How do we manage information flows to go back and forth so that it is actually the minimum amount of information needed to make an accurate decision?
I'm going to stress the point here because I feel like it's particularly important, and you have correctly, like you are spot on the principle of like what's reasonably doable, what's reasonably implementable. Reasonableness in this case, what we mean is that it has to be technically feasible. It doesn't mean that it has to be reasonable in terms of economic gains, for example. Which I feel like sometimes, when we talk about business and business models, of course, the costs and gains of a specific business activity are extremely important, and that is correct and right. And I'm sure many AI developers and providers have this in mind. However, what we talk about when we talk about privacy by design is technical feasibility. It's not whether it's economically viable for you and for your firm. However, I would like to point out that, of course, money matters in the sense that innovation and research needs to be financed. And I'm wondering if, in your opinion, is there an incentive from a kind of technical point of view to implement privacy by design measures? Is there an incentive to research into privacy by design?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's going to depend on the company and what it is that they're using machine learning for. I mean, I think the reason why we see a lot of investment, let's say, in privacy, in advanced privacy at the large scale AI vendors and cloud vendors and so forth, is because they understand the regulatory environment that their tools are being used, and they understand that it would be useful for them to both manage that regulatory environment, but also still uphold their business model, which at the end of the day is often around insights, I would say not from individuals, but from large scale data collection. And so when we think about some of the privacy technologies I've had a chance to work on in my career, many of them are being deployed by the larger tech companies. Very few of them are being deployed by the smaller tech companies. Now, why is that? One is that you talk about is resource issue and a prioritization issue. So if you don't think that a regulatory authority is going to come ask you about data collection, you might do the minimal amount that you see fit, which is totally reasonable. However, as you get into more advanced, let's say machine learning, right? At some point in time, if you're going to do advanced machine learning, if you're going to train your own models, you need to have data, right? The data comes from somewhere, it often comes from people. And I think right now what I've seen in my work in the industry is there's a huge gap between companies that are starting to do investment in data collection, but haven't yet reached the scale or point where they're investing in how do we do this with privacy in mind as a first principle of how we architect systems. And then there's companies that are already at, large scale data and they're doing privacy at scale. And there's a small group in between that you can find, or there's some smaller companies that say privacy is so important to us because of user trust, because of transparency, because of the part of, because the product we're selling, let's say, we're talking about Proton Mail or something. The product we're selling is built off of the concept of privacy. Perhaps those companies are building out privacy engineering teams, investing in that first and foremost. But I would say we have a large group of companies within, at least in my exposure, within European industry that are somewhere between this kind of older way of thinking about privacy, which is the minimum required privacy to do what we're doing, and what we see from the large scale vendors, which is let's run privacy engineering at scale with advanced privacy technology and invest in it because we know that we're in a regulatory environment that might require us to prove that we've done so. So I don't know if that's exactly what you were looking for, but that's what I've seen in industry. And I hope that more people kind of want to dip their toes in this transition because I do think um, what ends up happening is users do eventually, especially if there's a oopsie, decide to vote with their wallets and with their presence, right?
We also heard of privacy talks of privacy washing, which is pretending to prioritize privacy enhancing technology to show partial compliance with EU privacy law. Do you think these voices are a bit too skeptical, or is there a basic truth behind the critique?
I think like most of the washing, it probably depends, as in, I think it's quite easy to, hand wave and say, now I see a lot of companies also working in the machine learning space that say, oh, we're a privacy first company. Okay, what does that mean? Can you tell me exactly what it is that you're doing? Because I think too often we end up seeing, or I end up seeing, even I think well-intentioned efforts to build advanced privacy technology into a system. And then you go down to look at the receipts, like what actually do they mean? And at the end of the day, it's like PII hashing or something like that. And it's like, yeah, sure, that's fine, but that should be baseline. That is not, that is like, I could have done that in 1999, like, let's talk about what we're actually doing that has provable changes in privacy. And let's approach it with a technologist interest and curiosity. Let's talk about guarantees. Let's talk about the science behind technical privacy. And let's dive into that rather than just kind of hand waving, well, the server is on-prem. and the data at rest is encrypted or something like this. Again, table stakes at this point for a lot of things. So I think what I'm hoping over time is that there ends up being a maturing of what do we mean when we say something like privacy first? How do we talk about like professionals like you all and technologists like me, how we have and forge conversations where we can exchange and share information and we can end up leveling up not only, the technology and the engineering that's happening at an org, but also the entire conversation around what do we mean when we say quote unquote privacy preserving or privacy first.
Because you mentioned this idea that everyone inside an organization kind of needs to breathe privacy first. It's kind of a competency effort that needs to be shared throughout. You mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that a lot of people that you were not expecting would read your book because there were many legal professionals. In the course of your career, I'm sure that like from a technical point of view and from a technical perspective, you've had to kind of interact with people that potentially did not have so much technical knowledge or none at all. Um, if you were to tell our listeners, let's say 5 principles of how to deal with a non-expert sympathizing technologist, let's say, what would you say? Like, how should these teams work together? What's a good combination of values that could work?
Yeah, I think some advice if you're working with technologists and I've also worked with many people who are interested in privacy, but maybe just at the beginning of their career as technologists, right? Which is going to bring a different point of view is I think the first and foremost thing is I'm a big fan of launching a program like privacy education or privacy champions. So I helped launch at a previous employer the Privacy Champion program globally. First rolled out to just a subset and then globally. But I think you can do this at a small scale in a small company all the way up to huge multinational companies. And the idea is how do you get people that are already interested in privacy, want to act as advocates? How do you give them not only real education and skills, but also, I would say, federated responsibility? Because I think, especially when you're talking about an organization that ends up scaling or is at scale, or even an organization that's over 100 persons, is you as a privacy team or as a privacy professional, you only see usually what ends up coming across your desk. But there's a lot of stuff happening, obviously, in engineering that nobody in engineering, well-intentioned or not, knows should maybe be brought to you or not. And one of the things about starting an advocacy or a championship or even just a data stewardship program, of which privacy is one part of it, is you're going to end up seeing and hearing more of what's happening kind of on the ground. And you're going to start that conversation back and forth. And you're also going to essentially marshal those persons to feel more able to act as agents of themselves, to act with their own idea of responsibility as they're building or as they're working in teams. And I don't care if they're juniors, they just started yesterday, or they're people like me that have been working for 20 years. Like having that voice in the room when technical decisions are being made is extremely powerful. And I think goes beyond necessarily even just their starting level of knowledge of privacy. And that starting that communication, that type of program, I think is like a must do, I think, for every organization that wants to take, scaling privacy with their engineering seriously in any way, shape, or form.
That's absolutely brilliant, and we really hope that in organization programs such as this one you've been kind of advising will be set up, especially as time goes, and there are regulations that are starting to grow in this field, especially in the European Union, of course. just like a very quick question in terms of like if you wanted to maybe share something about that. Um, Coming from the privacy by design kind of background, do you think that, for example, the EU AI Act takes that into account? Does the EU AI Act correctly pursue the road of privacy by design, or is it something that it's kind of, let's say, mentioned, but not really at the core of the act?
I mean, I think we're going to have to see how the EU AI Act ends up getting enforced because as we all learned with GDPR, some of the devil's in the details on whether something will have impact or not and exactly how. However, I am a fan of numerous parts of the EU AI Act, and I think one of the parts that I'm a fan of for privacy is about increased transparency of both the provider and I forget the exact terms, but basically the provider and or owner relationship between the model developer and
The
those who
deployer,
are, sorry?
the deployer, provider and
Yes,
deployer.
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Exactly. Thank you. I was like, yeah, there is a term there. Anyways, you can tell I'm a technologist, not a lawyer. So I do think that the increased transparency around some of that, and there was some parts of the regulation, if I recall correctly, that also asked for extended transparency for when we release general purpose models of some of the training steps and training data. Now, of course, question mark how that's what quote unquote level of transparency we're going to reach there. But I do think that there has been a push, even just within the machine learning community and advocates for starting to publish more public sourced models with also some of the things that I also advocate for, things like privacy testing and evaluation as part of the model statistics and so forth. And so my hope is that regardless of whether it's explicitly in the AI Act, that the transparency pushes that are happening both within the AI Act and the community start ending up meaning that as a researcher, I'm incentivized to not only give more information about my training data, but I'm also incentivized to do things like privacy testing for problems like memorization, which we know happen in over-parameterized models or very large models like the ones we have today.
Yeah, the article, I guess you're referring to the GPAI kind of transparency block is between Article 51 and of course Article 53, which is something I actually wrote about yesterday because apparently the article has been enforceable since this so August 2025, and until now, the major AI providers, GPI providers, so we're talking about LLMs, of course, in this case specifically, have still not published the the transparency reports. So yes, it's an article that's there, but technically it hasn't been implemented at all. As in, like nobody has published information about the data used for training.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very powerful point in conclusion of this conversation. Um, I wanted to ask you, and this is, I promise, is the last question that we ask all of our guests, but I feel like in this case it's particularly important. So, first of all, let's remember that the book that many lawyers have read, so potentially some of our listeners too, I'm told by Giacomo, who made some research on this, that it is called Practical Data Privacy, Enhancing Privacy and Security in Data. So, guys, you can rush to the bookshops, potentially law bookshops, and purchase the book. But also, in terms of something that our listeners may want to do to understand a bit better the topic of privacy by design and how it's evolving and how it's applied to the concept of machine learning and, of course, LLMs and potentially agentic AI, who knows? I had to say the word. Um, do you have any suggestions, for example, podcasts, movies, books, of course, articles? websites to follow? Anything you have in mind?
Yeah, I'll of course plug my own work because I have a newsletter called Probably Private that has a lot of privacy nerds on it, and as well as a YouTube where I teach people about privacy technology and machine learning. That's also under the tag Probably Private. Those are some resources where you can learn from me and my work. I have a lot of peers. I think there's been some interesting books released on different privacy in machine learning. I can send over the exact links of some of them, but many of those are, I would say, academic reading. I don't know how interested people are in reading mathematical proofs, but some of the chapters may or may not have things like that. Um, and I am a really big fan of there's two books that I always recommend. One is called The Privacy Engineer's Manifesto. The book is quite is now some of the sections are dated, but some of the sections are still really, really relevant, even if the technology they're talking about is maybe not exactly what we use today. And there's another book that I really, really love called Privacy's Blueprint. And this one, I think, brings up a lot more questions than answers around how do we design systems. But I think they're relevant questions to what we're talking about today, particularly as we enter this era where indeed, as you mentioned, Rosie, like I might end up actually emailing an LLM and not a person. And I think we're starting to enter a realm or an era, if that becomes more commonplace than it already is now, we need to severely start rethinking how do we actually present an LLM as it is, and how do we get people to choose to interact with it or not, and. And it kind of opens up all of those questions again from a new standpoint. I think it's exciting time to work in this space, but also can be a bit overwhelming sometimes to keep up with whatever new paradigm people are deploying.
I do suspect that the reason why our listeners will not be reading very mathematical principles is not that they are not interested in them, but I suspect that the reason is much more probably private, as in like it's potentially that like me, they have a certain fear of maths. As I said many times on this podcast, I studied law for the purpose of avoiding maths. So that's exactly how it is. But our listeners will find everything you've suggested, including the links to your newsletter and to your YouTube channel in our show notes. So guys, do look them up. And I have to thank you so much, Katharine, for joining us on this podcast today. It was a pleasure to see you again, and we hope you'll come join us again in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Giacomo, for helping me in this interview.
Thank you, Rosie.
And this was all for the Legal for Tech, the podcast.
This episode was brought to you in partnership with DG Beetle. DG Beetle helps privacy professionals to stay up to date with the most important European documents in the AI, data and digital space every day. Curious to know more? Check out the link in our show notes.